Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, July 18th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Mountain West and Pac-12. It seemed like they were heading right towards a merger. There might be a little bit of a hurdle in that process in the next little bit, so we'll break down that for you guys. Then we'll get back into UGA and the traffic situation that has been happening with them, a ton of traffic violations over the last couple of years. We'll break down a new development in that and how it definitely changes the conversation just a little bit. Then we'll get into LSU and Brian Kelly. The last couple of jobs that Brian Kelly's had, year 3 has been just remarkable for him. We'll talk about whether or not it can be that way for LSU. Then we'll get into something that I'm sure you've heard about as a college football fan, what we call rat poison. And we'll talk about the 4 teams that are dealing with it the most and how they can kind of combat that going into the 2024 season. Then we'll get into a hot take Thursday, and I'll talk about coaching expectations in college football and how, frankly, I think they're just kind of broken and no one really has a good idea of what is actually supposed to be expected of their head coach. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, please do. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump in and let's talk about the Mountain West and Pac-12, because this is something that has been kind of talked about for quite some time. Pac-12 and its 2 members at this point, the Pac-2, Oregon State and Washington State could be ending up in the Mountain West. That is something that has kind of been picking up steam really ever since the Pac-12 kind of disbanded last season. They had an agreement with the Mountain West to do some scheduling over there, and people just kind of assumed that was going to be the way that things went, that either the Pac-12 was going to take some Mountain West teams or the Pac-12 was just going to join the Mountain West, and that would be that. So that has kind of just been the going theory for quite some time, and we've kind of pinpointed some Mountain West teams that could possibly join Oregon State and Washington State, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be as clean-cut of an answer as we once thought. And Dennis Dodd did a really good breakdown of this, talking about Pac-12 media days and how there was a ton of things that came out of that made him feel not super confident in that Mountain West and Pac-12 merger between the two. So it'll be really interesting to watch this, but one of the things he pointed to was the college football playoff agreement, and the Mountain West, frankly, is in a very good spot when you talk about that agreement. They really were, when you talk about the group of 5 teams, were definitely towards the top of the distribution and will be for quite some time, because they're going to get a team in there very, very often, whether it's Boise State or UNLV or Utah State or Colorado State. They're going to get someone into that dance a lot of the time. Obviously, the American is another fantastic conference, but Mountain West is very, very high on that list. And the question is, does Oregon State and Washington State, do they boost that enough? Do they make that big of a different conversation, especially with a lot of the different stuff happening around the country, with Clemson and Florida State possibly going to the Big 12 and some of the different changes? Does that really change the negotiations that much? Does that give you a bigger piece of the pie? Because frankly, I would argue it really kind of doesn't. But the reality is this is a very, very good conference. And this is a conference that is in a really, really good spot. So maybe it's not worth adding an Oregon State or a Washington State to this conversation and kind of muddying the waters a little bit, even if you're with not really a huge payoff financially from at least the college football playoff. And then continuing on here, obviously, he talked about the kind of addition of what the revenue could possibly look like for the Mountain West if they were to combine with all of these Pac-12 teams, and it said it would only be about a 10 to 15% increase. And the question about that is, it doesn't necessarily change much when you get into television negotiations. The whole thing about these TV contracts and how important it is to nail these TV contracts is you need as many big faces in the room. You need as many big players in the room that can kind of wield a lot of power. I'm not sure Oregon State and Washington State add this, monstrous thing to what the Mountain West has right now. I think they add a little bit because they were a Power 5 schools not too long ago, but if you look at the financial aspect, if you look at that, a lot of these things, if you take away the absolute war chest that the Pac-12 has set up for themselves over the next little bit, there's not really much that separates a Oregon State from a Boise State or a Washington State from a Fresno State. So I think that's the biggest thing here where, yeah, you would get a 10 to 15% increase hypothetically, but does it really make that big of a difference? And does that 10 or 15% increase not mean anything because the SEC is getting 20 more percent and the Big 10 is getting 15 more percent, and all of that stuff can kind of be happening around you that makes this kind of just a headache that's not worth going down. And then finally, I think one of the big things here is the Mountain West just kind of wanting to stay pat. They have done a really, really good job of kind of just being their own entity and kind of standing alone, especially in the Group of Five realm. They're kind of one of the conferences we look at most aggressively, and I think that's going to be one of the very interesting things. And on top of that, it goes into kind of this conversation of what is your brand power? What is your name power? And the Mountain West, obviously, right this second, is not necessarily quite as powerful as the Pac-12, but in a year, it definitely could be. In 6 months, it definitely could be. So I think that's the big question here is, if you're the Mountain West and you want to merge with these two schools, maybe you want to take the Pac-12 logo, maybe you want to take their name, but maybe at the end of the day, you want to just keep what's yours. You want to stay pat and you want to kind of expand that brand that you've already done a really, really good job of expanding, at least at the Group of Five level. So that'll be a really, really fascinating thing to watch. We talked about that kind of war chest, that $265 million that Oregon State and Washington State have kind of built up from Pac-12 payments, from CFP, from everything in between. Over the next, I believe, 10 years is when all of this is going to start to really come in. And the question is that really worth getting into another conference? And this kind of goes the other direction of Oregon State and Washington State going out and getting some of these Mountain West teams, like possibly a team like Boise State obviously would be at the very top of that list. And the question is, you have this huge amount of money right this second. You would have to go out and probably pay at least $18 million, possibly up to $36 million for all of these teams to leave, for each one of these teams to leave, But if you're going to do that and you're going to add 6 teams, let's say, that's upwards of about $200 million, upwards of $200 million there of your 265. Is that worth it for Oregon State and Washington State? And if it's not, which I would argue that it's almost definitely not, then would you just join the Mountain West? Would you just take what they have to offer? Would you take their brand and kind of move forward that way? So that's going to be a really, really interesting thing to watch, because for a really long time, we've been talking about the Pac-12 as really setting themselves up in a much better position than we thought they would be in, and kind of being in a position where so many options are open to them. But the reality is, as that money starts to go down, as that $265 million becomes $200 million, becomes $150, becomes $100, you lose power, and you lose it relatively quickly, because that's your clock. You know exactly how long you have, and it's how long it takes to spend that $265 million is how long you have to figure out all of this stuff. So that's kind of the question that they're under. How quickly can we figure all this out, and where do we want to go? Do they want to be a Mountain West program? Do they want to be those two teams in the Mountain West and kind of boost it just a little bit, but not necessarily help it too much? And is the Mountain West interested in that? Because they would likely have to pay some certain type of money and get involved in different types of things that might not be worth the headache. And obviously that's not the greatest thing for those two schools. And absolutely, I've been firmly a part of the team that has really wanted them to be a part of a big time conference again. But the reality is, I wanted that because I like these two schools, and I like seeing Oregon State and Washington State face off, and I like seeing them on national television. It doesn't necessarily play into who they are as brands and who they are on the football field and all of those different things. So while, I would love it, and while I think it would be a great thing to keep these two schools intact in the national conversation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are worth keeping intact. And I hate to say that, obviously, because I love Oregon State and I love Washington State, but the reality is the Pac-12 brand is the last kind of piece of this, and it doesn't really hold that much weight anymore. Now, it does hold a little bit of weight because it used to be a Power 5 conference, but when you walk into these rooms with ESPN, with Fox, they are very much focused on what are you bringing to the table? What can we sell of yours that is valuable to us? And 9 times out of 10, the most valuable thing for a conference is that name, is the SEC, the Big Ten. When you can slap that on any promotional thing, you're going to get a lot of eyes because there's a lot of people that care about those conferences. The Pac-12 can't really say the same thing, and they could, a year ago, they could 2 years ago, but the reality is how quickly everything happened and all the change that is happening and kind of the weird nature with which they're kind of sitting in the shadows right now. When they walk into that room with an ESPN executive or with a Fox executive, I'm not sure they're sitting there and saying, wow, we really want the Pac-12 to be across our billboards and be all across our pages, because it doesn't really mean too much. So the Pac-12 was in a position where you felt like they kind of had a ton of options open to them, but it doesn't change that they were in very low leverage positions. It doesn't change that they were kind of grasping at straws, and they kind of still are to a certain extent. And the Pac-12 in general is trying to figure out, what's the best way forward? Do we just merge with the Mountain West if they let us merge with them? Do we beg the Big 12 to let us join the ACC? I don't know what it looks like, but frankly, when I look at the Pac-12 right now, as you see that $265 million war chest, or whatever you want to call it, as you see that start to fall, things get more and more dire down there. So I absolutely love to see Oregon State and Washington State in a big-time conference again, but frankly, I don't think it's going to be under the Pac-12 name. I don't think they hold enough weight in the conversations that they need to hold weight in for it to matter. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch. Obviously, that amount of money will have a ton to do with it, so as time kind of rolls on, that money will slowly go down and things get a little bit more sketchy for those two teams. So it'll be fascinating to watch that, obviously, and definitely a very, very interesting thing to kind of unpack, because 2 years ago the Pac-12 was upright and standing, and in 6 months it could be tipped right over. So it'll be a really, really interesting thing to watch. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about UGA and the traffic violations that have been happening at that school. We're going to talk about a new development that Kirby Smart let us in on that definitely does change the conversation just a little bit. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the Pac-12 and the Mountain West and how a merger between the two is not necessarily as a foregone conclusion as we once thought. But let's get into segment 2 here, and let's start to break down this new development in the Georgia kind of issues off the field. Let's call it that. A ton of stuff has been happening around Georgia, and obviously the off the field issues have been a big topic of conversation. Smile Mondon and Bo Hewley were arrested last week for reckless driving, and I believe speeding for Mondon, if I'm not mistaken. And it brings up the total to more than 20 players for Georgia. I believe up to 24 for traffic-related in the past 18 months. Obviously, of those includes the tragedy that happened in January of 2023, where we lost Devin Woolock, a very good offensive lineman for them, and Chandler LaCroix, a staff member that was in recruiting. So obviously, this is going to be a huge topic of conversation. There's no two ways about that. That is always going to be something that surrounds the UGA football program, and it was going to be from that day forward. That's just the reality of that situation. And they haven't necessarily done a great job of keeping this stuff in check. But we do have kind of a new development in all of these talks, and something that I think kind of changes this conversation just a little bit. So I kind of want to get into that a little bit here. And the biggest thing here is, when Kirby Smart was at Media Days yesterday, he was obviously asked about this and had to address it a number of times. And he was asked about some of the different ways they're trying to combat this. And he said that the collective up there, the Classic City Collective that represents Georgia athletics, has been fining guys for quite some time, or withholding NIL funds is probably a better way to put it. But he says that is something they decided, that is outside his jurisdiction, and they're just searching for the best ways to go about this, and they have fined guys a considerable amount. In fact, Pete Nakos reported that it was over 6 figures that have been held from UGA players in the past little bit because of these violations, and that definitely does change this conversation. I was talking about this earlier this week, and we were talking about, what can Georgia do? What are the answers? What are the stones that have not been turned over? And to my knowledge, this was one that hadn't been. So I would kind of pitch this as an idea of possibly withholding those funds from those players if they get into this type of trouble. Georgia's been doing that, and it hasn't changed a thing. And I think that's the biggest thing here. And one of the things, when this came across my page, you feel kind of two emotions at the same time, right? I think the first one is, okay, at least, that's probably a good step in the right direction, doing one more thing to kind of help subside this big time issue that they have in their program, and obviously something that I am in favor of. So I was somewhat happy. And then you realize nothing's really changed. Nothing's, gotten different over this last little bit. I think they've done a fairly good job over there at Georgia in terms of head coaches and staff of reiterating just how important this stuff is to these players, and nothing's going through. And frankly, I'm at a loss for words, at a loss for answers for this thing right now. But the reality is Georgia's got to find one. One way or another, they have to find one, because there have been a lot of programs in the past that have been very, very successful, that have done a lot of incredible things on the football field, and then the off-the-field stuff gets them in trouble and kind of cuts short what could be a remarkable run in their history. So this is something that could happen at Georgia. I'm not saying they're on the verge of that. I'm not saying that they're on the tipping point by any means. I think they're very far from this becoming, a problem that buries the entire program. It doesn't change that it's a big-time issue, and it doesn't change that at some point, in some way, they need to get it under control. And I wish I had an answer. I wish I had something that, very obviously stands out to me, especially after this came out, that they could absolutely do. And I keep going back to the players being the leaders here. And I know that this is something that has been a little bit scrutinized, because it is putting a lot on these players to stand up in front of their teammates, their friends, and call them out for some of these things. I understand that's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a conversation that has to be had. This is becoming a very, very dangerous thing. It's not even about, football. It's not about this program. It's not about, how many games they're going to win on Saturdays. It's about these kids' lives. And it's one of those things that, regardless of how uncomfortable this is, regardless of how weird it might make Carson Beck feel to stand in front of the players and say something about this and call them out and try to be outspoken about this, it's got to happen. And frankly, I don't know that it hasn't happened. I don't want to sit here and say Carson Beck and his teammates have been dropping the ball in any way, because I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of people in that program are doing things the right way. I think they are turning over a lot of stones to make this happen. They have suspended guys. They just dismissed a guy from the program for violating team rules, and they didn't specify what the team rules were, but he brought it up during, Kirby Smart brought it up during his talk about this issue. So it's very possible that it was because of an arrest that he had back in February. So this is something that Georgia has been turning over just so many different stones. And it's not necessarily to say that they, are totally scot-free, that we should totally, take all the pressure off Georgia and Kirby Smart and, they've done their best and that's that. I'm not saying that by any means, but what I am saying is there's only so many things a head coach can do. There's only so many ways that he can hold them back from making some of these really, really bad decisions, frankly. And I'd love to tell you that Kirby Smart can keep everything, 100% intact and not have none of his players make any of these mistakes in the future, but that's not a reality. And I really wish it was, because that answer, I suppose, is somewhere out there. But when you've turned over that many rocks, when you've turned over that many different solutions, and you've tried so many different things, and none of it's taking, I don't know where they go from here. And that's kind of the scary point for this, because it's not getting better. It's not kind of taking that next step, and it's definitely going to be a very, very interesting thing. So, and yeah, I agree, Anthony. Absolutely. Carson Beck is a little bit more of a reserved guy. Definitely someone that leads a little bit more by example than being that outspoken person. And that definitely plays a part here. But there's other guys on the team that absolutely could do this. Someone else, Nazir Stackhouse, has been there for quite some time and has been a remarkable player for this team throughout this time. So I think that's someone that you could definitely turn to during this time. And then, frankly, someone that I think could really do an incredible amount of work over the next 6 months or so is this guy right here. Smile Mondin was someone that was arrested this last week for speeding and had gotten in trouble and is dealing with that currently. If he comes back in that room and is outspoken about this, if he comes back in that room and is one of the people leading the charge to make sure that this doesn't happen again, to make sure that their program gets on the right track and doesn't make these mistakes again, that goes a really long way. And I'm not, 100% certain it hasn't happened before with some of these guys that have gotten in trouble, but I know that this guy carries a lot of weight in that locker room. I know that he is a huge leader on that defense, and I know that if he comes back in that room and says, I really messed up, and it's something that I will absolutely never do again, and if you guys do it again, we're going to have a problem, I think that carries a lot of weight. And maybe it's, putting too much on them. Maybe it's unfair for me to expect that from these kids at the end of the day, but something's got to happen, and Kirby Smart and company seem to be turning over just about every single stone they possibly think. So it'll be really, really fascinating. Malachi Starks, another fantastic example of someone that could stand up and try to be that leader in the locker room. So I definitely think there is somewhat of an answer there, possibly. It definitely will be really interesting to kind of watch this, but the reality is UGA has a problem. They have an issue on their hands, and it's something that, as of right now, doesn't seem like it's a huge threat to what they're doing on the football field, but it can become that very, very quickly. And it's a threat to all of their kids off the field, which is a huge, huge issue. So it's definitely something that'll be fascinating to watch, but it's also something that will be interesting to watch off the field from the NIL's perspective, because when we were talking about collectives withholding this money from players, it's kind of a gray area. It's a very interesting thing that Matt Winter, who's a collective lawyer, kind of cautioned against this type of behavior, because it kind of walks a thin line legally in terms of what you can and can't do for these players in terms of fining them or withholding their money, because you can withhold certain money from contractors if they are involved with illegal activity. You can do that type of thing, but there are a lot of confusion around how players are supposed to be treated going forward, who they are going forward, whether that's employees or contractors or anything in between, and we don't have a firm answer. And that kind of leaves the door open for a lot of confusing things to happen in kind of the courtroom in that kind of area. So I hope that's not something that happens, obviously, and frankly, if this is something that we can't do, if withholding NIL money from players that violate team rules, that, get arrested, that have these type of things happen, we are doing something wrong. I'm just being totally honest. If we can't, hold these kids accountable financially in this future, that they're getting money and they're being professional athletes, that's going to be an issue. Just plain and simple. It's going to cause way more problems than it needs to, and it's definitely going to be something that they're going to have to deal with. So that's something that is kind of more of a side point. Just that has to be the case. They have to be able to fine or withhold money from these kids if they do make these mistakes, because frankly, if, defensive driving classes aren't working, and if speakers coming in isn't working, and if all of that stuff is not working, and this is another option to be had, then we have to at least try it. And all of this to say, it hasn't helped UGA. That's the reality of the situation. It hasn't helped Kirby Smart and his staff kind of curb this problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem that people are going to talk about, and they should, frankly, because it's something that is huge around one of the biggest programs in the country, and could be something that kind of hurts them in the long run, because as we've seen in the past, it's not necessarily the end-all be-all, but when you have problems off the field, it can trickle into your locker room pretty quickly. And that's something that Georgia has to be very, very careful of. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if it's collectives charging even more from these kids, even though it's about 6 figures that have been withheld from these kids in the last little bit. I don't know what the answer is overall over there at Georgia, but I know for a fact they have to find one. I know for a fact that they absolutely have to be able to move forward and have less of these things happen going forward. It doesn't necessarily have to stop pat, because kids are going to make bad decisions. That's just the reality of the situation that happens across the country. It doesn't just happen at UGA, but it happens at UGA just far too much. So that's something that will definitely be really interesting to watch. Obviously, this NIL collective adds another element to this, and kind of makes it a little bit more upsetting, because another stone has been overturned and didn't necessarily give them the result that they wanted. So it'll be really interesting to see what the next step is, because frankly, I don't know what Kirby Smart is left to do. I don't know what the thing is that he is meant to do at this point. He has suspended kids. He has gotten speakers in. He has done defensive driving. He has there's very few stones that have not been overturned by this guy and his staff to curb this problem. So I'd love to sit here and tell you that, they just got to, clamp down on these kids a little bit better and make sure that they make the right decisions, and that's going to fix everything. But they have, and it hasn't. So it's something that is going to be really interesting to watch, and could be the thing that kind of really hurts this program. So it's going to be really, really interesting, and it's going to be really fascinating to watch this, because it's not necessarily just about football. In fact, I would argue it's aggressively not about football. It's about these kids' livelihood and making sure that they're being as safe as possible, and it's just not quite happening over there at UGA. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch. We'll take our second break here. We'll definitely break that down more in the coming weeks. But we'll take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Brian Kelly and LSU. Year 3 has been really the charm for Brian Kelly at a number of different places he's been at. It might just be there at Baton Rouge as well. So we'll break that down after this. So stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about UGA and the collective withholding money from players that get involved with some of these traffic incidences that we've seen over the last little bit at UGA, and it adds even more questions to this conversation if you were to ask me. But let's get into segment 3 here and talk about Brian Kelly. Year 3 for Brian Kelly at pretty much everywhere he's been at has been really, really remarkable, and he's one of those guys in this industry that is, I want to say, disrespected. And I think that's probably the right way to put it, because I think there are a lot of people in the college football space, whether it's fans or media or whatever, that say he's overrated, that say he's, not as good as some other big-time coaches. And frankly, he is not far off from a lot of the big-time coaches in this sport. I would very, very comfortably put him in the top 5 of head coaches in this sport right now, and he's been successful at about pretty much every single place he's been at. He came into LSU and went to the SEC title game in the very first year. So it's very, very impressive what he was able to do at LSU in the first 2 years. But the reality is, year 3 is when a lot of things happen. I think we've all learned when you get into year 3 of every coaching cycle, that's when everyone wants to see real big-time results. And Brian Kelly is the exact same. He said year 3 is obviously the place that he really wants to get going. He really wants to kind of kick it into high gear for his program, and he says this is the deepest team he's ever had at LSU, so that obviously helps that a little bit for him. And at Central Michigan, year 3 was a 9-win year, MAC title. At Cincinnati, undefeated season, Big East title. At Notre Dame, went to the BCS National Championship, had undefeated regular season before just getting torn apart by Bama. But at the end of the day, it's remarkable what he's been able to do in year 3 of most of his jobs. So it's year 3 down in Baton Rouge, and it's definitely going to be really, really interesting to see what happens down there this upcoming year, because there's a lot of things that can go right for this team, but frankly, it's going to be harder than what he had in the last 3 places to reach the level that he wants to reach. And one of the biggest reasons, obviously, is the guy that's walking out the door. They had the number 1 offense in the country, and a large part of that was because Jaden Daniels was just downright special. And they had 2 first-round receivers in Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. that were downright special every single week of the season. So that is going to be a huge, huge topic of conversation. Also, on the defensive side of the ball, they're starting from ground zero pretty much. The only thing that they have in their back pocket, as far as I'm concerned, at least in terms of big-time players, is Harold Perkins. He is the guy that can really kind of turn the season on its head for them and definitely help them kind of get over that hump. But Brian Kelly had a very interesting conversation, and he had a very interesting quote at SEC Media Days where he said, clearly being the number 1 offense in the country was not good enough. I think we have to have much more balance, and that's the reality for this team. They can take a step backwards on offense, and I expect them to a certain degree, take that step backwards, but they got to take a big step forward offensively, just being totally honest, and Garrett Nussmeier is going to be the guy that's kind of leading the way there, and it'll be really, really interesting to watch if he is capable of doing that. He's definitely been sitting back for quite some time and waiting for his turn to kind of take over the reins and take the sticks and go to work. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a lot on his plate. And it's going to be a different looking offense, which I think is the biggest thing for me. When you look at the LSU offense from a year ago, it was a lot of Jaden Daniels just being Jaden Daniels, being as special as he is with the ball in his hands in open field, where you can run those read options, you can run a lot of the different kind of concepts that they did a lot of really good work on, especially in that Florida game when he just got loose for about 10 different 60-yard runs. So it was ridiculous what they were able to do with the ground game with him. That's not going to be the case with Garrett Nussmeier. He is a pocket passer. He is someone that he can use his legs. He's plenty athletic, but kind of like a Quinn Ewers type athletic, where if he needs to use his legs, he absolutely can and has a little bit of speed about him, but he's not that type of player. That's not the way he's going to make his money. That's not the way he's going to butter his bread, as it were. So that's definitely going to be a difference in this offense. You're going to sit back there and see a lot more pocket passing from the quarterback, but also you're going to have to see a lot more from these running backs. And Josh Williams will be leading the way, very much like this kid. I think he's really, really good. He's been there for just so long, and I think made his way up from a walk-on, if I'm not mistaken. So a remarkable story, and someone that I think has developed in just a really, really good football player. You also have Caleb Jackson there. You also have John Emery, who went into the portal, came back in, and so that'll be really interesting to watch. Caden Durham is a fantastic freshman running back that they have. So it's going to be different. There's no two ways about that. This offense is going to have to go about business a little bit differently, lean on those running backs in the running game a little bit more aggressively, and that'll be kind of interesting to watch, because that was the X factor, quote unquote, for that offense a year ago, was when Jaden Daniels gets out on the edge, there's not much you're going to be able to do. He's going to at least get about 20, 25 yards, and he might just make you silly and go for a touchdown. So that was always kind of the thing they had in their back pocket, and they kind of need at least the running backs to pick up the slack in that respect. So it'll be a different approach offensively. I don't think they'll be bad offensively by any means, because they have dudes pretty much all over the field, especially on the offensive line, which obviously helps Garrett Nussmeier sit back there and just pick apart defenses. But on the defensive side of the ball, that's where the focus has to be. And frankly, they got so much better in so many different ways. And the main way is obviously the staff. I could argue that this is the best defensive staff in the entire country. When you add Blake Baker as defensive coordinator from Missouri, when you add Bo Davis from Texas as the defensive line coach, Kevin Peoples came over from Missouri as well, kind of dealing with edge rushing a little bit more aggressively. They're going to be better. I can feel very confident about that. The question is how much better, because that will dictate, are they an 8-win team? Are they a 9-win team? 10, 11? Are they an SEC championship level team? That is what will decide it. How many steps can they take on the defensive side of the ball? And there are a couple of guys that need to step up. And Harold Perkins just has to be a freak, if I'm being totally honest. He has to be that freshman Harold Perkins that we saw, where it was just an absolute show from the start to finish. It was really, really incredible to watch him play. And he's going to be huge for this team. There's no two ways about that. And he's going to have to almost be a superhero for a lot of this if they're going to be a really successful defense. And then there's guys on every level of this defense that have to make big-time plays. There's no two ways about that. And it starts on the front. Jacoby Guillory is a very, very talented player. He played a lot of games last year. Jalen Lee is someone who didn't necessarily play too much last year, but came over from Florida before the 2023 season, is likely going to be the starter next to Guillory in that kind of interior defensive line. And at the very least, they got to play B-plus football. Those two guys have got to be at least good enough to hold their own against some of these big-time offensive lines, because that was the big issue with LSU. Obviously, the back end was rough. Obviously, so many things were not great about that team. But as we've talked about a number of times, when you can get that interior push, the edge rushing gets a little bit better. The back end gets a little bit better. The linebackers play a little bit better. So that's really where everything starts. And they need those two guys to play absolutely huge this season. Obviously, brought in Javier Suggs from Grand Valley State, who obviously can play another role there. But you're going to need at least two big-time defensive tackles. You're going to need at least two guys that can really kind of not necessarily impose their will every single down and dominate guys, but at least they'll hold their own to a really, really high degree. So that's obviously something Bo Davis will have to worry about this year, and he did a darn good job at Texas last year. So hopefully that kind of realizes itself at LSU this time around. But then the edge rushing just has to be the Braden Swinson show. He was one of the best players down the stretch for LSU on either side of the ball, really, but especially on that defensive side of the ball. And he's got to continue to make those big moves. He's got to be the guy coming off the edge that you're worried about as an offensive tackle. And some of this stuff will be helped by Harold Perkins being a little bit more of a pass rusher this year, which I expect him to be. And I think that's going to be a little bit different of a look. But Braden Swinson's just got to put on a show this year. He's got to have a ton of sacks. I don't want to necessarily say double digits, but that would help a ton. I'll put it that way. I definitely think he's someone that is a huge threat, and if they can really put it together, and if he can be someone that's super disruptive on that line of scrimmage, then things get really interesting. And then the back end was what everyone was talking about last year, because it looked darn bad for a number of times last season, and Sage Ryan has to be the guy, in my opinion. He is the guy that has the most experience. He's the guy that's been in the system not been in the system, but been at LSU the longest, and he's someone that is likely the leader of this back end. So you're going to need him to play better football. He has not played great, especially last year. It was very rough. He's back to safety, which is probably the better position for him, so that'll be an interesting thing to watch. But then you have guys at corner. You have Major Burns is going to be absolutely huge. Javian Toviano, the guy right there, I think is going to be a really good player for LSU this upcoming year, and he absolutely has to be. And then they might just be starting a freshman at one of the corner positions in PJ Woodland. So it'll be really interesting to watch this kind of back end develop the most, because that's the place that they need to take the biggest stride. And if they can, then it could have the biggest effect on their season. So to my estimation, LSU has the guys on their defense. I think there are a group of people that absolutely can make this defense at least formidable. They're not going to be great. They're not going to be dominant by any means, but they can at least play good enough football to make them a better team than they were a year ago, because they missed a huge opportunity a year ago with Jaden Daniels in that offense to possibly make some noise. But regardless, they can absolutely make some noise on the defensive side of the ball this year. The problem is all of the guys that I just talked about have to play really good football. There can't just be a weak link at Jalen Lee can't play bad football. Sage Ryan can't play bad football. There can't be that weak link within this group, because if there is, then you have a much bigger problem. So that will be really, really interesting to watch. And they're walking a really tight rope. There's no two ways about that. LSU is absolutely fighting something that is going to be really, really hard to pull off this upcoming year if they want to compete for an SC title, if they want to do some of the things that I know for a fact Brian Kelly wants to do. But the reality is they have the right guys to kind of walk it right now. I think Brian Kelly is a fantastic head coach, although some people would say not quite as good. Then you have Blake Baker, you have Bo Davis, you have just a remarkable staff around you. So walking that thin line becomes just a little bit easier because you're putting guys in winning situations. And when you have some of the athletes that LSU is just always going to have, that helps out a little bit. So LSU is kind of in the shadows going into this year, kind of a team that remarkably in the SEC is not being talked about too much, with UGA and Texas and Bama and Ole Miss and everyone else getting that conversation. I think they like it that way. I think Harold Perkins was the one at SEC Media Days that said, yeah, don't think about us, and we'll just kind of go out there and play football. So it'll be really interesting to watch this team develop. I tend to believe it's not going to be an elite team by any means. I tend to believe they'll be about a 9-3, maybe a 10-2 team, and possibly make the playoff, but I lean towards not. But at the end of the day, Brian Kelly has made a lot of really cool things happen in his third year, and maybe the same thing happens in Baton Rouge this year. But we'll take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about rat poison, that thing you've heard about a number of times throughout the offseason where you're talking just too nice about a team, and you have to kind of fight that, fight against complacency and things like that. So we'll break down who's fighting the rat poison the most in 2024 and how they can kind of combat that. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about LSU and Brian Kelly and how year 3 has been the charm in a number of different places for Brian Kelly, and maybe it's that for LSU. It'll be really, really interesting to watch, but don't necessarily have those high hopes for them, but it'll be really fascinating if they can pull that off. But let's get into segment 4 here, and let's talk about rat poison. If you've heard this term, I'm sure you have if you're a big-time college football fan. Essentially, rat poison is just being too nice to a team, saying a team is going to walk through a conference, saying a team is remarkably talented, saying a team that is so much better than everyone else in their conference. All of that qualifies as rat poison. It kind of makes a team a little bit more complacent, a little bit more prideful, a little bit, takes that edge off just a little bit, and it's something that was really the magic of Nick Saban at Bama. There was every single year you were walking into the year with a ton of rat poison for that team. Everyone was talking about how good Bama was and how that defense was going to be impossible to score on, or that offense was going to be impossible to stop, and they were going to do incredible things, and all of that never entered the building. Nick Saban didn't allow it to enter the building. He made sure his players came every single year and said, you have earned absolutely nothing in this program. And it's something that actually Kirby Smart's doing it over at UGA. Whenever you hear him talk about how you're getting your guys ready after a national title the last couple of years, or after, a fantastic season and so much going into this year, he just says, the guys in that room have proved absolutely nothing. There was a couple of guys that, they have a couple of trophies on their mantle and they've been a part of national title teams, but some didn't start. I would bet that if you ask Carson Beck how many national titles he has, he said, well, I have 2, but technically I have 0 because he was not a starter. He did not play in those games, and that's the mentality you have to have if you're going to be an elite team in college football, and especially an elite team for an extended period of time. So let's get into some of these teams that I think are going to be huge in terms of rat poison and kind of fending it off this upcoming year. I have one from each of the Power 4 conferences, so let's jump into this. And the number 1 team, I think, is the number 1 team for rat poison overall. That's Ole Miss. This team has been just fallen in love with by so many different people throughout the offseason, and for good reason. There has been so many things happening around there that are just absolutely remarkable, and the talent level is a national talent. The talent level is a national title talent level. Wow, that was a real confusing wordage. But at the end of the day, this is a very talented team. They've done an incredible work in the transfer portal to create a team that is scary to other teams, that is, on the level of the Bamas and the Texas and the UGAs of the world from a talent perspective, and are doing some of the things that Lane Kiffin has just missed the mark just a little bit early on in his time at Ole Miss, but finally has kind of hit those right buttons, and it'll be really interesting to watch. Obviously, Lane Kiffin is someone that you've probably heard this term from. He definitely calls it out on Twitter whenever it pops up on his page, and he's someone that is very outspoken on this, and he's learned from the best. We talked about Nick Saban. He knows exactly how to handle this type of thing for his team and keep everyone engaged, and it'll be interesting to see if he can handle that. I think one of the big things that definitely does help him here is you have a veteran quarterback, and you have some veteran players on this team that can be leaders for this team. Obviously, you're bringing in a ton of transfer portal guys, but when you have Jackson Dart, when you have Trey Harris, when you have some of these players that have been around for a year, 2 years, have learned this system and learned Lane Kiffin a lot, there's a little bit more comfortability to this, and there's a little bit more ability for those veteran players to call out the younger players or the newer players and kind of deal with this type of stuff. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch. Obviously, everything is moving in the right direction for this team. A revamped defense. Lane Kiffin, in my opinion, is coaching the best ball he's ever coached in his career. So a lot of stuff is happening in the right direction for this team, but with that comes a lot of expectations and a lot of rat poison, and it's not easy to keep all of these 18 to 22 to maybe 25-year-olds all really engaged all at the same time. It's an incredibly hard thing to do, and the people that do it win national titles, and that's what Ole Miss wants to do. So it'll be really interesting to watch that. But moving on to the Big Ten, this one's not even a question. It's definitely Ohio State. I thought about Oregon. I kicked around that idea a little bit, but I think walking into a new conference kind of snaps them back into place a little bit and makes them a little bit more focused than possibly Ohio State could be. And this one's just a little bit different because they have every single reason to not fall victim to this. Every single thing every piece of motivation that Ohio State could possibly have going into the season is had going into the season. It's absolutely insane how much motivation, how much intensity is going into this season for Ohio State. So they have to avoid it. There's no two ways about that, but I would argue the last 3 seasons they have not. I think they've walked into some of those Michigan games and just looked like the team that wanted it less. Looked like the team that walked in thinking that they were going to win, and that's never the way that you can walk into a rivalry game. Obviously, you have that confidence, you have that swagger, that's a great thing to have, but walking in complacent is not ideal, and frankly, that's the way it looked on screen for a lot of the last 3 years against Michigan. So I think it's going to be something that's going to be really interesting to watch because Ohio State absolutely should be totally locked in, should not have any moments where they get a little bit complacent, but it's been a problem for Ryan Day teams in the past, and definitely has been something that has kept them from winning national titles and from being that team that they're capable of being. So coming into a year when you're called the most talented team in the country, when people are saying you could walk to a national title if certain things go your direction, and frankly, I agree with that a lot of that sentiment, but it doesn't change that it's ridiculously high expectations, and it doesn't change that a lot of people singing your praises that widely can make you just take your foot off the pedal just a little bit. And that's definitely the difference between a national title and, maybe fighting for a Big Ten title. And that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Obviously, Ryan Day and company have every reason to fight it off and should be able to fight it off, but they haven't really been able to in years past. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. For the ACC, it's another very easy choice. The Miami Hurricanes coming into this year is absolutely the team that everyone's looking at and saying, look at the talent, look at the Cam Ward coming in, Mario Cristobal is finally getting his offensive line and defensive line in place, everything is going in the right direction, this is the year for Miami Hurricanes. That adds a lot to this team, and I think the thing here that is a little bit different than Ohio State is they haven't been towards the top over the last couple of years. They haven't dealt with what it looks like to play in an ACC title, to play in a game where you're undefeated late in the season, you have to get a win to make the playoff, to play in a playoff game. They haven't felt any of those emotions, and with a lot of these expectations, you feel like you're entitled to those emotions. You feel like you possibly, deserve to get to the ACC title from the beginning of the season, and you deserve for Cam Ward to be a Heisman level guy from the beginning of the season. That's all rat poison, and that's all really dangerous to a team that is walking a thinner line than I think some people think they are. Whenever you have a ton of transfer teams, it's kind of the same thing I feel about Ole Miss. They're walking a thinner line than most people think. It's not to say that they aren't a talented team and they can't do remarkable things this year, but when you bring in that many new guys and you have to kind of make them all meld together, it's much easier said than done. So it's definitely something that is going to be really, really interesting to watch. And for the most part, I think this is a team that is very capable. There is nothing about this team, at least on a paper standpoint, that I feel bad about. But there are areas of this team that are a little bit, wary. I think Mario Cristobal possibly being that, I don't want to say authoritative figure, but someone that kind of holds the reins a little bit too tightly and doesn't kind of release when he needs to. And there's certain things that can kind of get in this team's way, and it's going to be really, really interesting to watch. But they are dealing with a lot of that hype, a lot of that rat poison, and Mario Cristobal's got to make sure those guys are ready to go, because everyone wants to beat Miami this upcoming year in the ACC. I can promise you that. But then finally, the Big 12, I have Utah. So this one's the only one where I have a new team coming into the conference, and I think this one's a little bit different because in the Pac-12, they weren't that team. Coming into the season, Utah was rarely the team that everyone was talking about, that everyone was pointing to and saying they're the team that is head and shoulders better than everyone else, and they're definitely going to go to a conference title and possibly win it. That really never happened in the Pac-12. Even when they were a fantastic team and absolutely elite in every way, there were people picking USC, there were people picking Oregon or whoever else in the Pac-12 and not necessarily focusing on Utah too much. That's totally different this upcoming year. Everyone's saying that's the team, and frankly, I hold that sentiment as well. I think this is a team that should be in Arlington at the end of the year to playing for a Big 12 championship. I think KSU is a little bit closer than some people might say, but I do think this is a team that is setting the pace in the Big 12. And the big thing for this is when you have a lot of rat poison and things can get complacent, having that veteran leadership is huge. And when you have Kyle Whittingham and Cam Rising, a lot of that stuff takes care of itself. Cam Rising is obviously going to be someone that is going to keep guys in check, is going to make sure that guys are coming up to practice every single day and playing with the same exact intensity that they always play with. And Kyle Whittingham does not accept anything but 100%. So that'll be really, really awesome to watch, and definitely makes me feel a little bit more safe about Utah dealing with this than some of the other teams I just talked about. But overall, I think all of them are capable of dealing with it and likely will deal with it okay, but it sneaks in for a team about once a year, and it'll be really interesting to see if one of those teams is that team. But that doesn't even include teams like Texas, Missouri, Oregon, Florida State, all coming off huge years, and then UGA and Bama always deal with this. They're going to deal with this till really the end of time, at least if Kalen DeBoer and Kirby Smart continue to do what they're doing. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really fascinating to watch. It's always that thing that's a little bit behind the scenes, and you don't really understand why a team that came in with so much hype is not performing. Sometimes it's not even a talent level thing or a coaching thing. Sometimes it's just a psychological thing, and that'll be really interesting to watch over the next little bit. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a Hot Take Thursday, and we're going to talk about coaches and how I think the coaching expectations in college football are just a little bit broken, and I'll break down exactly what I mean right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the teams that are dealing with what we call rat poison in college football this upcoming year, just getting a little bit too much hype and how they kind of can combat that this upcoming year. But let's get into our final segment, and I think coaching expectations in college football have kind of gone a little bit crazy. There's a number of different reasons for this, but it's something that I've kind of noticed over the last couple of years, and specifically after the playoff was introduced, which is a huge piece of this, that a lot of people don't accept anything less. When, all the talk around bowl opt-outs and all of this stuff started happening, it was because a lot of fans and a lot of media were talking about the playoff as if it was the only thing that mattered, as if it was the only way you could have a successful season if you were in the playoff. And if you weren't, too bad. You had a terrible season, and that's that. And that's something that kind of infiltrated its way into the fandoms and into some of the decision making at some of these big time universities. I think one of the big things here is I understand that all of us as fans, we don't fully understand what it takes to build a program. A lot of that is because we don't fully understand what's happening on the field at a lot of the time, because there's so many intricacies and different things that we don't pick up on. But the reality is it's remarkably tough to get everything in place the exact way you want it, especially when you're taking over for a staff that didn't do a great job or that put you in kind of a tough position going forward. And that's something that has happened a number of different times, and a number of guys who, frankly, I think were doing a really good job at their current place and were kind of building out there, got cut short because they weren't doing it fast enough. And I get that we want instant gratitude. We want to have our team making those big time strides every single year, but that's not always the reality in college football. That's not always the reality in sports. It's always a non-linear type thing, and it's something that has kind of created some problems for some coaches in the future, and it could create problems for some coaches going forward. Deshaun Foster is someone that I think is going to do remarkable work at UCLA. I think he's going to build a program that actually can be worried about in the Big Ten and can be a player in the Big Ten. The problem is it's going to take a lot of time. They are in a position right now at that program, inside and out, that it's just not where it needs to be. Now, I think the talent level can get a lot better, and a lot of things can happen to kind of expedite that process a little bit, but it doesn't change that some of the behind-the-scene issues are still there. NIL is not where it needs to be for UCLA. Some of the things that you have to jump over that you used to not have to make this job that much harder, and it's made this that much more of a problem, in my opinion. So that's something that he's going to have to deal with. Cannot wait to see him as the UCLA head coach, because I think he's going to be remarkable, but it's a worry that I'm sure that he has in the back of his mind of, if I don't have it done in year 3, are they going to kick me to the curb? And that's a reality that a lot of coaches face. Dion is not necessarily under any pressure this upcoming year of getting kicked to the curb, but what happens if he falls flat the next couple of years and Colorado fans get a little bit impatient, or the brass up there gets a little bit impatient? It'll be pretty hard to fire this guy, I'll be totally honest, but at the end of the day, it is something that he has to worry about. So this is just the reality for every single coach. Whether you're at a big school, small school, medium-sized school, they want you to perform. They want you to keep moving forward every single year, and sometimes that's just not in the cards, whether it's, the people around you or the personnel that you have. Lincoln Riley, he has made mistakes since he's taken over at USC, and the main one among them, I think, keeping Alex Grinch as long as he did and keeping that defense where it was as long as they did. But the reality is a lot of good things were happening out there, and a lot of things are still moving kind of in the right direction. It's just moving a little bit slower than people want. So I think that's someone that frankly could be under a little bit of fire at the end of the year if this year does not go the way that USC fans want it. So that'll be really interesting to watch. But the guy I want to zero in on here is Billy Napier. And this is a little bit of a touchy subject for a number of people, because people have a really, really aggressive stance on this guy, whether it's he shouldn't be at the Power 5 level, or he's a terrible head coach, or whatever it is about this guy. People seem to have very hard-lined opinions about the way they think about him, about the way they view him in the college football world, and I understand it. Florida has not been nearly what they need to be the last couple of years on the football field. That doesn't mean good things aren't happening. I think people people forget how bad of a position that he was brought into. And it's the reality that was happening down there at Florida when Dan Mullen, the last couple of years while he was at Florida, it was a disaster. And that was mostly off the field. That was mostly, not having a lot of the talent level, whiffing on some big time recruits. A lot of the issues that happened were kind of behind the scenes. It doesn't change that when Billy Napier showed up in Gainesville, Florida, there was a lot to overturn. They had a great season in 2019, led by the Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts, and did remarkable things that year. But the next 2 years were an outright disaster, and it buried Florida in a number of different ways, and recruiting was well below where it needed to be for Florida to be elite. And I'm not saying they've totally fixed all those problems, but it just gives you an idea of what Billy Napier walked into. The first year, they were not going to be successful. I understand he had Anthony Richardson. I understand there was going to be a lot of energy behind that team. They had a terrible offensive line. They had a really bad defensive line. They were not good defensively overall. That was not going to be a good team. Last year, they were not necessarily going to be that strong of a team. It was going to be a team that had their chances for sure and definitely could have made noise, but at the end of the day, they were not elite enough at the positions they needed to be elite at to compete in the SEC. That was just the reality regardless of who the head coach was. And that's the thing that I've always heard from Florida players, from people covering the Florida program, from people who have been inside that building, is they feel like everything's moving in the right direction. And that's what Billy Napier said. He feels like in some ways they are on schedule. Obviously, they want to get more wins and they want to perform better on the field, but they are recruiting better. They are getting a better infrastructure in place. They are doing a lot of things in terms of culture and in terms of alignment that really matter for this program to be successful going forward. And I'm not sitting here and saying that he absolutely has to have a job after this year. I'm not saying that they can't fire him or it's, unfair to him by any means. I'm just saying what he took over was much tougher than people give it credit for. I think it's the same thing that happened for the first couple of years of Steve Sarkisian's time at Texas. What he took over was much worse than people give it credit for. It's not to say that they didn't have talented players. It's not to say that Texas wasn't able to play better football than they did the first couple of years. It's just to say there was so much to fix. There was so much to rebuild on the team, on the roster, on the coaching staff, and behind the scenes, which is likely the biggest piece of this now, that it's unfair for me to say, Texas hasn't been good in the first 2 years of Steve Sarkisian's time, so kick him to the curb. And year 3 was when all of this stuff started to happen. So obviously it's taken Billy Napier time. And obviously it's something that Florida fans are getting just a little bit impatient about. And I totally understand that sentiment because you want to win. And you want to win quickly and you want to keep moving forward. And I fully understand that. I'm just saying when you take over a program with as many problems that Florida had behind and in front of the scenes, it's going to take longer than 3 years. It just is. It's going to take longer than a couple of years to get everything moving in the right direction. And there were people that were ready to bury Billy Napier after year 1 because they didn't necessarily live up to the remarkable hype that he had. So all of this to say, I don't want to harp on Florida for too long here, but he's done a number of really good things. Yes, they have not necessarily come out on top of as many games as they wanted to, but they got guys like DJ Lagway and LJ McCray into the program. They got Jakeem Jackson, who's a huge player for them. Eugene Wilson, who likely is their outright best player on the team right now, all brought in by this man. And whenever they talk about their program, they talk about it a very different way than everyone else does. So none of this is to say, Florida is a great program. None of this is to say that Billy Napier should absolutely keep his job, but I've been trying to figure out what the moniker is. What's the number that I want him to hit to say he can absolutely stay the coach of Florida? I think it's 6. I think between this schedule, everything behind the scenes, the roster still getting to where it needs to be, I think if he hits 6, I would keep him in the building. I would keep him as a head coach because I think there is a lot of things moving in the right direction that the second that one thing happens on that football field, the second that last switch is flipped, there's going to be a ton of wins to be had for this team. So obviously it's kind of a weird conversation because Billy Napier is in a really tough spot going into this year. There's a reality where he goes 6-6 and is let go. And I wouldn't necessarily love that, but I would understand it to a certain degree because I get that college football is a sport that you want instant gratification, especially in the world of, the playoff and competing for national titles and the transfer portal and being able to bring in a lot of these new guys. But it's really hard to build a program. It just is. I mean, there were people that wanted to tear down Jim Harbaugh after a couple of years at Michigan, and he was on the verge of getting fired, but he stuck it through, and he built a program that is as solid as they come and won a national title. So all of this to say, I understand that this sport is different now. I understand that the playoff is such a big deal and everyone wants to be in the playoff, and if you're not, it's a little bit disappointing. But there used to be a time when an Orange Bowl invite meant a lot. There used to be a time when an Orange Bowl invite was such a big deal, and even a Capital One Bowl invite or a Boca Raton, it doesn't matter. The point of playing a postseason football game was awesome for teams. Now we have more than 30 guys opting out of an Orange Bowl game. That's insane to me. And I think that plays into all of this stuff that we're talking about, where you have a ton of people saying the playoff is everything. The playoff is everything. And it's trickling over into the decision making of these coaches who some just aren't going to make the playoff. Only 12 teams can make the playoff, and some teams just aren't even in the realm of doing that because of the situation that they were left. So all of this to say, I understand that people want a lot out of their head coaches, and I understand they get frustrated around year 3 or year 4 if they haven't seen real progress on the field. That doesn't mean real progress isn't being made, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't give these guys a little bit extra time to just figure out, what their team is going to be, figure out what their identity is going to be, and then see what happens, see where the chips fall. And all of this is kind of probably going to fall on deaf ears, to be totally honest with you, because the reality is you want to compete. And if your guy's not competing, it's very easy to kick him to the curb. So I can't imagine that anything is really going to change. But all of this to say, this is a very thin margin sport. Building a program, building your program is an incredibly hard thing to do. And burying a head coach after 2 or 3 years is a little bit ridiculous to me, but I don't necessarily see it changing anytime soon. So obviously that's a frustration that I have, but maybe other people don't see it the same way. Maybe I'm alone in that. I don't know. But at the end of the day, it'll be really, really interesting to watch how some of these coaches are treated in the next little bit and how the expectations play a part in all of this. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content updates you could possibly need. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.